Half-Life 1 is a game older than me. It came out in 1998 and is a first-person shooter and a basic puzzle solver, something like, looking for the button to press, running around and doing the right things. It's an extremely innovative game for its time and basically set the scene for the next, 10 to 15 years of FPSs. Before Half-Life, most first-person shooters had, sort of 80s, early 90s look and feel. Not very smooth controls, graphics very blocky, gameplay, basic shoot stuff. The stories weren't really integrated the same way into the gameplay, the same way it is today. All this changed with Half-Life and then was, really solidified by the games that came after, but Half-Life still came first to do a lot of the things. And while, the engine, kind of looks dated with the graphics, it's way better than, the stuff that came before. With Half-Life, they're sort of, you know, the characters have relatively detailed textures. In contrast, if you play an FPS before Half-Life, there's a lot of things that just don't have as good graphics. Um, the other thing that stands out with Half-Life and most other Valve games is the almost complete lack of any breaks in gameplay. There's almost never any cutscenes. There's only one in Half-Life, and it's a sort of blink and you'll miss it kind of deal. Most of the story is portrayed through in-game events. This is combined with a sort of unique style of loading the levels. The levels lead into each other. Every once in a while, the game will lag for a second as it loads the next part of the game, but it's a lot quicker than any loading screens, and there's no breaks. This is a feature of all the Half-Life games, and the first Portal game, the second one, has loading screens, but there's no loading screens that show up when you're in the game. It never stops. It makes the whole game seem more like a continued experience rather than sort of a series of levels, which is a huge advantage for immersion. That and then combined with the smart game design, good music, art style, overall design, you have a hit game that was able to launch Valve from sort of an unknown thing to a household name that runs the largest collection of PC games, Steam now. First, I want to discuss the general art style, music, and feel of the game. Black Mesa is designed very well, with the starting train ride giving you a great sense of the scale and variety of the Black Mesa areas. The music didn't stand out to me, but it didn't have to. It fit in so well with the other parts of the game that it was unnoticeable, which is sometimes, that's what the music's supposed to be. These features come together to create a distinct, sort of feel in the design of the facility that is emulated even to this day. If you've ever played, one of the SCP games, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of inspiration from, Half-Life in the whole of SCP. Everything in this game, right down to the corridors and walls, contribute to this sort of unique feel of a top secret government lab, but it's not a military base. It's it's a research lab that's top secret and run by the government, but it's a lab. It's not a military base. Before Half-Life, that wasn't really a thing. It was top secret military. It was a top secret government thing. It's military, or it's a top secret military base. But now, the whole idea is different. It's shifted. Probably the biggest factor in all of this, however, is the sort of characters and storyline, which is very good, and I'll talk about that next. Half-Life does something interesting, which is that the story is very intertwined with the gameplay. There are cases where it could be problematic to ignore the story because you need to know what was happening to play the game. Don't misunderstand me though. The story never came in the way in the game. The story is just so well implemented that you can simply play the game and you will understand the story. Games didn't always do that. I mean, think of something like Mario, where the story is basically just the stuff in the game manual and, maybe a cutscene in between each level. This well implemented story takes what would normally be just a, sci-fi horror story, and it takes it to the next level where you're playing through it. And then, in order to fit the mood of the game, the characters are added. And characters is a bit of a stretch. They're not really the same as, the characters in Half-Life 2. But they've still got pretty good voice acting, and, the AI is good enough to be AI. Yeah, the AI is just pretty good for that time. The scientists and security guards give the facility sort of a living character. You don't get that with just art. It takes an empty facility and it fills it. Without the random characters, the game would just be boring. They're also pretty essential to the story. There's less point to finding your way through all the aliens if nobody else is around. The enemies are well characterized, but not to the same extent of the Black Mesa employees. They didn't want you to be sympathetic to the aliens and soldiers since, you're supposed to kill them. In particular, the head crab is such a well-designed character. It's the first enemy you face, and it's kind of the hardest to kill. It's such a good design that, people would take inspiration for it. I remember playing through Halo, and the flood is basically just the head crabs. It makes the zombies, which are only kind of cliched now because, they've been on this zombie thing since the late 90s. And its jumping attacks is hard to deal with, which leads into the next section quite well, the gameplay. The gameplay is perhaps the only section where Half-Life doesn't quite get perfect marks compared to the other sections. It's more due to difficulty than any poor design. FPSs were just harder back then, with stuff like Doom and Duke Nukem being pretty hard compared to something you might see today. The gameplay can become repetitive, but it's mostly prevented by introducing new guns and new enemies, well paced throughout the game. It keeps the player's interest through all the way to the final boss fight. The final boss fight, however, is very annoying. It's not hard to the point of just giving up, but it's not easy. I died several times just trying to figure out how you're supposed to hurt it, and I looked it up beforehand. Even looking up, it's hard to understand what you're supposed to do to deal damage, and the way the fight is, you only spend half your time even able to hurt it. This is a final boss fight where you have to figure out how to win, which makes the situation a lot harder, and when you do figure it out, it's still pretty hard. I know people who don't play Half-Life 1 and just go on to Half-Life 2, because Half-Life 2 is a lot better in this regard. In Half-Life 1, you die a lot more, and when you do, it usually gets you into this situation where you can die over and over until you get past that part of the level. This can make the game, infuriating in certain situations and, decrease the amount of fun you have. But overall, the gameplay is still good, and it was still able, people still played through it. At the time, it was a lot better because the gameplay just hasn't aged as well, the characters and setting. It's a lot harder for an FPS than what people are used to. But overall, Half-Life is a very good game that I would suggest you play, not inherently because it's, a perfect game. The gameplay is really quite difficult, but mainly so you have the context when you play Half-Life 2, because Half-Life 2 is a lot better, and with the gameplay and just everything. But that being said, Half-Life on its own is still very good. It's just a little dated in terms of difficulty. Set aside somewhere between a week and a month to complete the game, as you will spend a certain amount of time beating your head against sort of brick walls of enemies in game, dying over and over again to certain enemies until you finally beat them. It's difficult, but it's clearly not impossible. It just has sort of a 90s thing. I give Half-Life a 0.889 out of 1. It's very good, but it's also quite dated at this point. Half-Life 2 is significantly better, and I suggest you play Half-Life 1 so that Half-Life 2 makes, sense.